Chapter 077. Testing. Primordials were strange, enigmatic creatures. They were supposedly firstborn children of the primordial dragon from which the world was fashioned, ancient and powerful. In life, their abilities had rivaled those of the gods themselves. In death, they had spawned a multitude of lesser primordials to continue their struggle. One would think that such fearsome beings and everything related to them would be vividly remembered by history, but this was not the case. In his search for primordial prisons outside Cyoria, Zorian had consulted many church documents, historical records and elementals, largely in vain. Primordials may have been powerful and frightening in their heyday, but they had been sealed away thousands of years ago. That was a lot of time for information to be forgotten, especially since the gods had actively tried to limit knowledge of them and their prisons while they had still been active in the world. Thus, finding any substantial information on them was quite hard. Moreover, even when such information was found, it was hard to gauge how much of it was reliable and how much of it was pure fabrication. A lot of the stories that bothered going into the details of the nature of primordials were mutually contradictory, and there was no way to test any of them to see which one was closer to the truth than the others. In other words, you know virtually nothing about primordials except that they exist and that one of them is imprisoned in Cyoria, Silverlake concluded after hearing their explanation. Yeah, pretty much, Zack confirmed. Although they were searching for the locations of other primordial prisons in their free time, that hadn't produced much in the way of actual results. What does this have to do about confirming the truth of our story, though? Patience, boy, patience, Silverlake urged smugly. A house must be built from the foundation up. In order to answer that question, I must first show you the truth about primordials and the way they were imprisoned. She could actually answer those questions. Zorian was torn between excitement and a healthy dose of caution. On one hand, this was a powerful witch that has lived through more than a century. Surely she wouldn't be making claims like that without a good reason to be confident? On the other hand, well, it was Silverlake. After some thought, he decided to voice his concerns to the old witch in front of him. Ignorant brat, she complained. Do you think I'd be joking about something this serious? Zack and Zorian shared a knowing look between each other. Well, yeah, Zack said as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Now that you mention it, that does sound like something I would derive dark amusement from, Silverlake mused, rubbing her chin with her hand as she stared at the tree branches above her. Not exactly something you should be proud of, Zorian pointed out unhappily. Anyway, do you want to hear what I have to say or not? Silverlake asked loudly, abandoning her musing pose in favor of folding her hands over her chest and looking at them both defiantly. Sure we do, Zorian said. As annoying as the old witch was, she had some very unique skills and insights that were almost impossible to find elsewhere. Let's hear it. Silverlake stayed silent for a few seconds. Before either Zack or Zorian could say anything about that, the entrance to her secret hideout flared into life again and another Silverlake stepped out of it, carrying a large brown book in her hands. Zorian raised an eyebrow at this. Silverlake having some kind of duplicate was not that surprising. There were lots of spells that duplicated the appearance of a caster in some way after all. Even if it was an actual simulacrum, Zorian still wouldn't find it unusual, since Silverlake was clearly proficient in soul magic. The really interesting question was which Silverlake was the real thing. The one they've been talking to all this time or the one that had just walked out of her dimensional hideout. He activated his newly acquired soul perception and took a look. It was not easy for Zorian to use his soul perception. Training it had been slow and frustrating thus far, though he had been told by Alanik that he was doing just fine by normal standards. He'd had the ability for less than a month, so it was to be expected that his control over it was crude and that he had trouble interpreting what it was telling him. Zorian imagined this was how non-psychics felt when they tried to train their non-structured mind magic into something usable. Still, identifying whether something in front of him had a soul or not was well within his modest capabilities. With that in mind, he focused his soul perception on Silverlake and immediately realized that she indeed had a soul. She wasn't an illusion, a remote-controlled puppet or a simulacrum then. So they had actually been talking to the real Silverlake up till now. That was nice to know. Just to be thorough, he shifted his soul perception to the approaching book-carrying Silverlake and he had a soul too. What? Zorian shifted his attention between one Silverlake and the other repeatedly, trying to work out what was happening here. It was no use, though. His soul perception simply wasn't sophisticated enough to unravel this mystery, and he didn't want to start casting analytical divinations at the old witch and her weird clone. Blatantly scanning someone without their explicit permission was widely considered to be rather rude and insulting behavior. The other Silverlake soon reached the one Zack and Zorian had been talking to and gave her the book she was carrying. The first Silverlake glanced at the book, nodded slightly, and then snapped her fingers. The other Silverlake seemingly imploded, badly startling both Zack and Zorian, her form collapsing into a smoky black ball. The ball existed for only a moment before reforming itself into a large black bird, which promptly hopped onto Silverlake's shoulder. It was a raven, Zorian realized. Of course. Zorian thought, slapping himself in the forehead. Silverlake had a raven familiar. The link between a mage and their familiar allowed both of them to assume the form of one another really easily, provided that the mage knew the proper spells. And Silverlake no doubt knew the proper spells because familiar magic was one of the things that witches were known to be really fond of. Hell, she'd even found the way to shield the raven's mind from scrutiny, preventing Zorian from easily identifying it as a shape-shifted animal. Zorian opened his mouth to say something but was interrupted when Silverlake tried to blow away the layer of dust on the cover of the book and ended up sending herself into a coughing fit due to all the dust suddenly flying into her face. The raven cawed indignantly at this, flapping his wings a couple of times for emphasis. "Shut up," Silverlake said to the raven in between her coughing and wheezing. She glanced towards Zack and Zorian. "And why are you two just standing around like that? Come closer and take this blasted thing away already. Who do you think I brought it for? Do you think I wanted to refresh my memory or something?" Zorian stepped closer and Silverlake immediately pushed the large leather-bound tome into his hands. He grunted softly and took a step back, caught off guard by her sudden movement and the book's considerable weight. "Then this thing was heavy. Read this and everything will become clear," Silverlake said, finally getting her breathing under control. Zorian eyed the heavy leather book in his hands suspiciously. The cover was brown and nondescript, with a title that proclaimed in plain white letters that this was a collection of cookie recipes. Flipping the random pages of the book seemed to reinforce this claim. He glanced at Silverlake and saw that both she and the raven perched on her shoulder were eyeing him closely, waiting for his reaction. With a small sigh, Zorian swiped his hand across the book and cast an appropriate dispel, shredding the illusion covering the book into pieces. Following that, he was confronted with a lot less innocuous title, Unspeakable Cults, Volume 4. "You just can't resist pulling these kinds of tricks all the time, can you?" Zorian asked rhetorically. "You made a lot of tall claims today," Silverlake shrugged. "It's only natural for me to test them every now and then in small ways. If you two are really a bunch of old time travelers like you claim to be, a simple illusion wouldn't have posed a problem for you. Besides, I can't exactly leave a book like this out in the open without disguising it somehow." "What do you mean?" Zack frowned. Unspeakable Cults is one of the most widely banned series of books circulating around Altazia and Zlotic, Zorian explained, idly leafing through the book. All sorts of ghastly drawings and descriptions immediately assaulted his eyes. It was written by an anonymous author that had a penchant for infiltrating secretive cults and mage organizations so he could observe their ceremonies and activities. No one is quite sure how he did it, but considering the furor the books created, it's clear he didn't make it all up. Anyway, after infiltrating all these cults and watching them for gods know how long, he wrote a series of 8 books that go into great detail about what he had seen. Every debauchery he had seen, every messed-up sacrifice or morally bankrupt experiment is described in great detail, and he even illustrated some scenes with drawings and diagrams. Although the books contain no actual spells or ritual setups, they have been banned almost everywhere as blasphemous, degenerate filth. He closed the book, eyeing it in great distaste. He really didn't want to read this stuff. "I don't suppose you're going to tell me what page I should be looking at?" Zorian asked Silverlake, staring at her pleadingly. Silverlake just grinned at him nastily. "Damn witch." Zorian glanced towards Zack speculatively, but the boy immediately shook his head at him before he could even open his mouth. "No, no, no," Zack said quickly, extending his arms in front of him in a warding gesture. "Sorry, Zorian, but this definitely sounds like a job for you. You have a lot higher tolerance for this kind of stuff than I do." As much as Zorian hated to admit this, his fellow time traveler kind of had a point. Reading the minds of high-ranking cultists, Sudamir, Ibasan invaders and others had shown him enough of the dark side of humanity that he had been numb to the horror of it all to a large extent. He still didn't want to wade into a book like this one though, so he decided to get a little creative. He started casting divination after divination spell at the book, trying to divine the section of the book that Silverlake wanted him to read. This was harder than it sounded because the book was heavily warded against divinations and did not ever mention primordials by name, but Zorian was very good at divinations by now. Especially these kinds of divinations. He'd had his simulacrums in charge of researching mountains of documentation for obscure clues for quite a while now, so a task like this was pure routine by this point. After 5 minutes or so he found the section that seemed right and flipped the book open. Both Silverlake and Zack peered over his shoulder to look at the page he had picked. "You're no fun boy," Silverlake said, scowling at him. Zorian took that as an admission that he had indeed found the right page to start at and began to read. The chapter in question described a small cult of mages, somewhere in Zlotic, which worshipped an entity imprisoned behind some kind of dimensional veil. They did this by capturing unwary travelers, implanting some sort of magical worms into their brain and then forcibly establishing contact between their mind and the mind of the imprisoned entity. Normally, mental contact with the entity resulted in quick insanity as one's mind was overwhelmed by the flood of incomprehensible thoughts and images, but the chemicals released by the worms as they fed on the victim's brain tissue somehow allowed them to last longer under this assault. Drugged out of their minds to keep them talking and half insane, the victims would then spend the next couple of hours screaming, pleading, cursing and babbling gibberish while the cultists diligently wrote down their feverish ravings for later study. After repeating this process gods know how many times, the cultists eventually assembled a fair amount of information about this entity, which the cultists called the Golden Feathered Worm. To Zorian's eyes, it appeared clear that this golden feathered worm was actually an imprisoned primordial, even if the book never actually identified it as such. Because of the relatively unpleasant nature of the text, the somewhat archaic language the book was written in and the unhinged nature of the insights obtained by the cultists, it was tempting to just dismiss all of their findings as delusional gibberish. However, after rereading the chapter a handful of times and thinking of it in some detail, he felt there was some actual insight hidden amidst the insanity. The victim's mutterings of eyes between spaces, time that moves in braids and spirals, bones that stretched inside and outside, and other such nonsense all hinted at the idea that the golden feathered worm was a very dimensionally complex being. The path of the golden feathered worm is the path of the self as the universe, the book said. Indeed, the rest of his kind is also as such, each one a world unto itself, their flesh but a thin, porous cloak to hide the depths beneath. That was interesting to say the least. The book was basically saying that primordials were not really creatures in the way Zorian commonly understood it, but more like living miniature universes. He didn't know what to think about that. It sounded crazy, and considering where it had come from, Zorian would normally dismiss the idea without a second thought. He handed the book to Zack, who had given up on trying to read over his shoulder a while ago, but would probably still want to see what the book had to say. Zorian couldn't wait to see his face when he got to the lovingly illustrated description of the worm implantation procedure. "So?" Silverlake asked, not bothering to wait for Zack to read the book too. "What do you think? I presume you're referring to the idea of primordials being living universes masquerading as flesh and blood beings?" Zorian asked. "Wait, really?" Zack asked incredulously, slowly leafing through the book. He was going through it too fast, so Zorian assumed he was only skimming the text instead of meticulously poring over it like Zorian had done. "How does that work?" "Read the book and you might get your answer," Silverlake said blandly. What a lie. Zorian had read that chapter several times over and he still had no idea how that could possibly work. "But yes, that is what I was getting at." "Great," Zack said. "But what does that dash?" "I think we are living inside a primordial," Silverlake said. There was a brief pause as they both digested this statement. "I think you're going to have to explain that a little," Zack said slowly, letting the book hang by his side for the moment so he can focus on her better. "Well, provided that what you are saying is at all reliable," Silverlake said. "You are saying that this sovereign gate thing can copy the entire world and create its very own miniature universe to house it all. Oh, and run the whole thing at absurd temporal dilation levels. That is not the level of power you get from a divine artifact. The gods may have been able to build such things, I don't know, but I have never heard of them handing out something on this level of power. Surely such a device would require an absolutely titanic expenditure of divine energy to produce, no? Sounds like a lot of effort just to give a mortal a new toy to play with. On the other hand, if the sovereign gate is just a modified, mutilated primordial, well, suddenly the whole thing becomes a lot more plausible. Turning one of their ancient enemies into an item like that and handing it down to a measly mortal to use and abuse sounds exactly like something the gods of old would do. Especially if the primordial in question had irritated them particularly badly by primordial standards. A long silence descended upon the scene as Zack and Zorian considered the plausibility of the story. Silver Lake waited calmly for their reaction, hands clasped behind her back. She appeared to be trying to project an air of serenity and unshakable confidence with her stance and expression, but the effect was ruined by the fact she couldn't stop herself from nervously tapping her foot against the ground as she waited. Silver Lake could be onto something, Zorian decided. It had always seemed to him that the Sovereign Gate was ridiculously powerful, even for a divine artifact, and this was as good an explanation as any as to why this was the case. He suddenly remembered the Icosian myth of how the entire world they lived on had been fashioned by the gods out of the body of a defeated primordial dragon. He'd never taken the old myth very seriously, but maybe there was something to that story. You said there might be a very easy way to check if we're telling the truth or not, Zack said cautiously. Is this related to that? Are you saying it's somehow possible to check whether we are inside a primordial or not? Well, perhaps, Silver Lake said, humming softly to herself. You see, I have known about the primordial sealed away in Cyoria for quite a while, and have been carefully studying its prison from time to time. It was never the focus of my studies, but I reckon I know it quite well. If my speculation is correct, I should be able to notice some kind of change in the prison when I study it again. I refuse to believe that being recreated in the body of another primordial will not have a noticeable effect on it. Well, truthfully, my first instinct is to say that such an item couldn't possibly affect beings on the level of primordials, even if they are sealed away. But from what you say about Panicseth, I am completely wrong there, so whatever. Anyway, let's go check. Now? Zorian asked with a raised eyebrow. Is there any point in waiting? Silver Lake challenged. I guess not, Zorian admitted. I'm just a little surprised at your decisiveness. I've just found out I could be trapped inside the body of a primordial godlike monster that probably hates all humanity, Silver Lake said, looking like he was an idiot. Of course I want to confirm or deny this as soon as I can. Don't you? A copy trapped inside a body of a primordial godlike monster, Zorian corrected her. And you were preceded by countless other copies that lived out their short lives in vain, all their thoughts and accomplishments undone at the end of the month, Zack added. A bunch of brats, both of you, Silver Lake told them. Let's just take a look at that primordial prison in Cyoria for now. You two know how to teleport, right? We do, but there is no need for that, Zorian said. I have a much better way for us to get there quickly. Break. After the three of them returned to Cyoria, via Zorian's dimensional gate spell of course, they immediately proceeded towards the place the primordial was imprisoned in, the massive circular abyss around which the city of Cyoria was built, known simply as the Hole. Fortunately, accessing the hole was not terribly hard. Although the incomprehensible amounts of mana gushing out of it were the foundation upon which the city rested, the hole itself was not monitored very closely. The biggest concern the city had about it was that it was rather popular for people to commit suicide by throwing themselves into its depths, which meant they had to put a token patrol here and there to try and curb this behavior. These patrols were not very good and only checked the most obvious approaches to the hole. So long as they didn't bring too many people and avoided making a spectacle out of themselves, they could linger inside as long as they wished. As they descended into the hole's depths, Zack and Zorian questioned Silver Lake about her interest in primordials. Silver Lake claimed it was not something she had ever been overly concerned with. It was just that she had been alive for a long time, and even casual study could build up to something substantial when you keep chipping at the problem over several decades. She also claimed that, like them, she did not know of any primordial prisons other than the one in Cyoria. Zorian wasn't sure he believed her, to be honest. She knew Panicseth's prison well enough to give her confidence that she could detect changes in its dimensional boundary, but she'd only studied it casually. Zack and Zorian could only faintly detect the presence of the prison and little else. And it wasn't like their attainments in the field of dimensionalism and divination were low. Furthermore, while their search for other sites of primordial imprisonment had yet to bear fruit, they did have no less than 3 promising leads already. And that was with them casually directing some efforts at the problem, rather than dropping everything to pursue the issue. He was supposed to believe that Silver Lake couldn't manage to find even one additional prison after spending gods know how many decades of interest in the topic. He had a feeling Silver Lake was seriously underselling both her level of interest in this and her attainments in it. He even suspected that her incredible level of skill in the field of pocket dimension creation might come from pursuing this line of research. He did not voice his suspicions, though. He could tell that, although Silver Lake was putting forth a confident facade in front of them, the things they had said had deeply disturbed her and made her uneasy. If he was too pushy, she might feel backed into a corner and lash out. Frankly, she had never struck him as the most stable of individuals to begin with. They didn't have to descend far into the hole to get access to Panic-Seth's prison. Unlike the Palace Orb and other pocket dimensions that Zorian was familiar with, primordial prisons seemed to have larger and more complex anchors to the main reality that extended over quite a large area. In fact, considering that Zorian had once witnessed Panic-Seth breaking out of his prison in the sky above Cyoria, he suspected that the anchor extended well outside the hole itself. It was just that those parts of the anchor were too subtle for Zack and Zorian to detect them. In any case, once they had reached sufficient depth, Silver Lake asked them to shut up and let her examine the prison in peace. So they did just that, sitting down on a couple of nearby rocks in silence while Silver Lake did her thing. Zorian paid close attention to the spells Silver Lake was casting. Though one couldn't learn a spell just from watching someone cast it, they could get a pretty good idea of what the spell was supposed to do if they were experienced or familiar with the relevant theory. Zorian was both, so there was a lot he could tell by watching Silver Lake analyze Panic-Seth's prison. She used dozens of individual spells in her investigation, each one of them a lengthy and complex thing that seemed narrowly specialized for one specific function. Such unoptimized, hyper-specialized spells were probably something she had made herself, specifically to tackle the problem of analyzing a primordial's prison. Furthermore, she cast these rather unwieldy spells with practiced ease, making no mistakes whatsoever, strongly suggesting she had done them often enough for it to become rote. Casual interest, sure. As time went by, Silver Lake's face started to frown more often and her casting became more feverish, but she remained completely silent and focused on her task. She didn't even mutter to herself as she was often prone to do. Finally, after more than 2 hours of casting, pondering and intense staring at the empty patch of air in front of her, what was that even supposed to do? Silver Lake let her arms drop to her sides, sighed and then turned towards them. "All right," she said. "You win. I provisionally believe your crazy story." "Provisionally?" Zack asked curiously. "We're clearly in a different world than we were up until a few months ago," said Silver Lake. "It does not necessarily mean your specific version of events is what is happening, but I have no better explanation at the moment. So for now, I'm accepting your story as valid. Just to confirm, you actually detected a noticeable difference between Panic-Seth's prison as it was a few months back and as it is now?" Zorian asked. "I suppose you could say that," Silver Lake said, a note of discomfort creeping into her voice. "Why the glum face?" Zack asked, picking up on her mood. "Didn't you expect to find just that?" "I expected to either find that the prison is some kind of poor man's knockoff of a real primordial's prison, or that it was thoroughly unchanged from how it was before and that you were trying to feed me a pack of lies," Silver Lake said. "But," Zorian prodded, "but it's the same prison as it has always been, just seen from a different perspective," Silver Lake said, lost in thought for a second. She scowled when she refocused back on them and saw them looking blankly at her. She clacked her tongue. "Bah. I can't believe I have to explain myself to a bunch of amateurs like you. Well, let's try it like this. You know how a dimensional gate looks like it's composed out of 2 discrete portals but is actually just one dimensional construct with 2 ends? The prison in front of us is like that. I can sense the changes in it, but a closer look reveals they are clearly superficial. It's the exact same object just seen through a different lens. Panic-Seth's prison exists simultaneously in both the real world and whatever the hell this place really ends up being. This sovereign gate of yours couldn't duplicate primordial prison grounds, but it could make them attach themselves to this world in addition to their original one, and it's giving me a headache." I don't know how this could possibly work, and I don't know why someone would bother with this. Why didn't this divine toy just neglect the primordial prisons entirely instead of going to all this trouble to ensure access to them even in a recreation of a real world? Arg. She pulled at her hair for a second, not very hard mind you, she seemed to do this just for dramatic emphasis, and then turned back towards the gaping abyss in front of them, staring at it in deep thought. After a few moments of silence, Zack asked the obvious question that Zorian was pondering as well. If the primordial prisons are objects that exist both in the real world and the time loop reality, doesn't that make them a sort of a bridge, for the lack of a better term? Zack asked Zorian quietly. If so, it might be possible to use them as a sort of conduit for opening a passage between this world and the real one. Hell, releasing one of them from their prisons might not even be necessary. I wouldn't place my hopes too high on such an idea, Silverlake suddenly said. Apparently she wasn't so deep in her thought that she couldn't eavesdrop on their conversation. Primordial prisons are hard to perceive, never mind interact with. It would take vastly more skill to use them as a spell conduit than... She suddenly stopped and turned around to face them, an incredulous look on her face. Wait, what was that about releasing one of them? After convincing Silverlake that something funny was going on with the world at large and that their time loop explanation was at least a little bit plausible, and smoothing out some unfortunate misunderstandings, Silverlake reluctantly agreed to continue teaching them pocket dimension creation. In addition, Zorian had managed to talk her into selling them the analysis spells she used to study Panaxeth's prison in exchange for both of the ingredients for her potion of youth. As much as she complained that such a trade was profoundly unfair, due to the mechanics of the time loop, she just couldn't resist getting her hands on both of the ingredients she needed to complete her potion of youth. Unfortunately, convincing Silverlake that they were onto something had one major unfortunate side effect. She was suddenly extremely interested in them. She wanted to know everything about them, where they came from, who their family was, where their allegiances lay, what their skill set was, how much money they had at their disposal, everything. And when they had refused to cooperate with that, she started to spy on them. And then mobilize some of her contacts. Apparently she wasn't as much of a total hermit as it appeared at first glance, to gather information on them when it turned out they were too good at evading and foiling scrying attempts and other magic-oriented methods of spying. This would be very annoying even at the best of times, but what made this especially problematic was that Zack and Zorian were already doing all sorts of eye-catching things, arranging all kinds of high-value trades and throwing around ridiculous amounts of cash. This worked just fine as long as nobody was focusing on them, but the moment a bunch of nosy people were told to specifically look into what Zack Novita and Zorian Kaczynski were doing, well, suddenly they had a lot bigger reasons to be interested than one witch's curiosity. Even if Silverlake backtracked and told these people that she changed her mind and no longer cared for the information, they wouldn't stop their investigation now. Caught off guard by this change in their routine and forced to temporarily lay low, Zack and Zorian turned to other things to amuse themselves with. In Zorian's case, that something was the study of divine artifacts. Sitting around in a secret, warded house, Zorian stared at the small collection of items in front of him. There were 7 of them in total. A small silver pyramid, a dark brown wooden staff, a golden bell, a pitch-black disc covered in seemingly random scratches, a large green gem with several light motes trapped within, a large bronze compass and a plain-looking iron dagger. The dagger had been recovered from the ruins inside the Portal Palace orb, while the others had been shamelessly stolen from private collections and treasuries of small countries. Although it looked unremarkable, this pile of items would likely inspire greed in even the richest of individuals living on the continent. You know that it's almost impossible to find something useful by studying divine artifacts, right? Diamond said, staring intently at the gathered items. Zorian had reluctantly invited Diamond to join him in this task, seeing how he had much more experience with this sort of thing than he did. Entire groups have dedicated their lives to studying one specific divine item and came out empty-handed in the end. Yes, I know, said Zorian, picking up the dagger they had found in the orb and flipping it in his hand. They still had no idea what it did, other than being supernaturally sharp. Divine artifacts were immune to divination magics, so the only way to discover their uses was to either use trial and error or search through historical records to see if there are any descriptions of the item's powers in ancient texts. But I have something most of those groups don't, a willingness to destructively study the item in question for any clues and have it come back intact at the end of each month. Diamond made a sour face at him. This feels so wrong, he said uneasily. These are priceless, irreplaceable relics. It's sacrilege. Yet you agreed to come here and participate in it, Sorian noted lightly. Well, I can't say I was never tempted to do something like this, Diamond sighed. Are you sure they'll be back to normal? I'm sure, Sorian confirmed, pointing at the dagger in his hands. I already dismantled this dagger in the previous restart and it's back to normal now. However mysterious divine abilities are, the Sovereign Gate clearly has no issues in duplicating these items over and over again. That's both reassuring and terrifying, Diamond noted. Sorian wondered what his brother would say if he told him that they were currently stuck inside some kind of weird primordial thing that may or may not be alive and just waiting for a chance to devour them all. Alas, as funny as it was to fantasize about his reaction to that, it wasn't worth the drama to actually go through with telling him about it. So before we begin, I'm kind of curious, Sorian began. How did Fortov react to that illusion disc I made for you? The disc was something the Daimon of the previous restart had come up with. In order to help him convince Fortov to open up and talk to him, Daimon came up with the idea of a disc that would, when activated, project an illusionary scene of their talk in the previous restart. Sorian was skeptical of the idea. Why would seeing such an illusion convince Fortov of anything? But Daimon insisted it would work, so Sorian humored him. He tapped into his memory of the evening and constructed the most realistic illusion of the event he could before binding it to a disc that he left in Fortov's mail. Strictly speaking, that was the end of his obligations in regards to the matter, but he kind of wanted to hear what the outcome of that stunt turned out to be. Well, you could say it sort of worked, Daimon said with a small grin. Oh? Sorian asked with a raised eyebrow. He's talking to me at least, Daimon shrugged. That's all I really wanted out of that disc, so I have no reason to complain. How did you explain the contents of the disc? Sorian asked curiously. I didn't, Daimon grinned. I used the mystery as an incentive to talk to me. I said I would explain everything in a month. Sorian rolled his eyes at him. Anyway, I also have something to talk about before we dive into all this, Daimon said, sweeping his hands over the gathered divine artifacts. I'm pretty sure I have narrowed down the location of the key piece that was lost in Zlotic. You have? Sorian asked, leaning forwards with anticipation. He had to say his brother's help was proving itself invaluable when it came to jobs like this one. If Zack and Sorian had to locate all the missing pieces of the key all by themselves, it would have taken them much, much longer than this. Where is it? Is it the Tower of Hylosna? I hope it's the Ziggurat of the Sun, Daimon interrupted him. Sorian leaned back into his chair with a groan. Out of all the possible options, the Ziggurat of the Sun was definitely the worst one. It was situated deep into the interior of northern Mycena, in an area that was once lush grassland, but was now located deep within the Zlotic desert. There were no major human settlements nearby, just an endless expanse of desert. Simply approaching the Ziggurat required a lengthy, difficult trek through these parched, desolate lands. And any expedition that reached the Ziggurat itself would be faced with the tiny issue of the Ziggurat's current inhabitants. Sulrotham, a species of giant sapient desert wasps that had taken over the structure when the deserts had claimed the whole area. Sulrotham were almost 3 meters long, possessed incredible strength and toughness, and there were hundreds of them living within the Ziggurat. As for their friendliness, well, Sulrotham was a local human word roughly translating to devil wasp. Sorian kind of doubted they would allow them to peacefully search their base for ancient magical artifacts. Sorry, Daimon said. I know how you feel, but I'm pretty sure I got it right. The Imperial Ring is there, provided the Sulrotham haven't already found it and taken it elsewhere. Which is a distinct possibility, Sorian noted. At least you have that inbuilt key detector, so we'll know if the ring is no longer there before we waste too much time on securing the place, Daimon shrugged. Of course the damn ring has to be in the most difficult location possible, Sorian grunted unhappily. Just getting there will be an issue. Actually, I think I have a solution to both that and how to reach Blantyr in a reasonable time frame. Daimon grinned before throwing a rolled-up poster at him. Have a look and tell me what you think. Sorian caught the poster before it had time to hit his face, gave Daimon an unamused look because he was pretty sure his brother deliberately aimed the object at his head, and then unrolled it to take a look. It was a propaganda poster, basically. It showed a pretty picture of a weird-looking wooden ship that was apparently commissioned by the king of Aranhul, one of the larger nations in Zlotic. It was an airship, Zorian realized. An expensive, experimental airship designed by some of the best artificers in Aranhal as part of some kind of national vanity project. It was mostly done, the construction crew was just putting finishing touches on it currently, and it was planned it would undergo a test flight in a few weeks. So, Daimen said with a knowing smile on his face. What do you think? Zorian stared at the poster for a second before looking Daimen straight in the eye. I think we have ourselves an airship to steal. Chapter 078. Grinding Stone. Airships were not held in very high regard among people who cared about such things. The idea of a flying vessel was something that had captivated mankind since time immemorial, of course, but every concrete design for such a vessel had been disappointing. After all, although magic could make a ship fly easily enough, doing so on a long-term basis was very expensive in terms of mana. Moreover, this cost increased massively if one wanted to not just fly but fly fast and retain a healthy amount of maneuverability in the process too. This was why very few mages employed magical flight without a pressing reason to do so, even though flight magic wasn't that complicated and many mages were capable of it. As a result of this fundamental issue, most airships couldn't actually fly around as they pleased, but instead had to follow fixed paths that took them through mana-rich areas that could sustain them in the air. And even so, airship designers still had to ruthlessly keep the vessel's weight down during construction. This made the resulting product relatively fragile and greatly limited the vessel's usefulness. They also tended to be rather expensive to build and maintain, as the materials which went into them tended to be on the pricier side, and the design of the vessel itself was something that required a whole team of skilled professionals. It also didn't help that there was no standard airship design available to the public, meaning that most airship construction teams started their projects from scratch and were often the only ones who could truly fix or modify the vessel. Finally, there was a tiny yet very important issue of how incredibly lethal an airship crash was compared to, say, the sinking of a seagoing ship. If anything went wrong, it was all too easy for everyone on board to die. There had been a number of high-profile airship accidents over the years, including a rather spectacular one where the Tetran airship Gepard plunged straight into the sea not long after starting its maiden flight. And even if one ignored the possibility of a simple malfunction, there was still the matter of the many flying magical beasts that could easily crash the airship if encountered at an inopportune time. In light of all that, it was not hard to see why airships weren't in more widespread use. They were not economically viable for private interests, and state militaries generally found flying magical creatures to be more effective as an aerial combat force. Despite that, people stubbornly kept trying to make them viable. There was something about a flying vessel that people found irresistibly captivating. There were considerable differences between regions, however. The states of northern Mycena, for instance, were the leaders when it came to investment into airship research. Due to the vast stretches of desert that surrounded them, the nations of Zlotic saw more potential in airships than Altasian ones. Building roads and railways in the inhospitable interior of northern Mycena was exceptionally difficult, and there were few population centers big enough to justify an expensive teleport platform. A free-flying, economically viable airship that could traverse the Zlotic desert would be a huge boon to whoever made it. Pearl of Aranhal, the airship Zorian wanted to steal, definitely hadn't been designed with economic viability in mind. No expenses had been spared in its construction. Although Zorian had not been able to find concrete numbers anywhere, the final price tag was rumored to be positively astronomical. The airship's capabilities, however, were said to be appropriately impressive for something that had so much money sunk into it. It was fast, maneuverable, and surprisingly robust for an airship. Most importantly for Zorian, though, it boasted an experimental power core that allowed it to operate independently of ambient mana for long periods of time. After some discussion with Zack, they decided not to make a move on the airship in this particular restart, however. Half of the restart had already passed and they were already committed on many other fronts. Besides, due to Silver Lake's earlier inquiries, people were still paying close attention to them. Zorian still decided to look around a little to get a feel for what they were dealing with. Unsurprisingly, the airship was under significant protection. Not so much against thieves, since the idea of someone outright stealing the airship was kind of ridiculous, but against spies and saboteurs. The defenses were tight enough to thwart Zorian's casual probing, but he was confident he could get through them in time. It might take several restarts, but it would happen. The bigger problem, in his opinion, was that the Pearl of Aranhal required a crew of 10 in order to take off and land, which made the idea of 2 people stealing it somewhat problematic. He would probably have to wait for Zack to be able to cast the simulacrum spell before they could make the attempt. Another problem, though a comparatively smaller one, was that some small but critical pieces of the airship hadn't been installed, and possibly not even made yet. Zorian was confident he could manufacture and install these components himself, but he would need access to the relevant blueprints first. Once upon a time, one of my ambitions was to examine a train to see how its engines work, Zorian thought to himself nostalgically. Now I'm casually planning how to steal and analyze an experimental airship in my free time. Even taking the time loop into account, it's still amazing how far I've come since then. I wonder what my old self would have said to something like that. That, of course, was something impossible to answer. He shook his head and focused on more immediate matters. Currently, he was going to meet someone he hadn't spoken to for a very, very long time, Zenemir Algai, the old language expert he had once sought out to help him figure out what happened to him. Back then, he had been murdered by the invaders not long after talking to him, so he had reflexively avoided the man ever since, suspecting him a spy. However, none of his investigations of Abasan collaborators and cultists pointed to Zenemir being one of them. Thus, when Zenemir's name popped up while seeking out a translator that could help him with some of the documents he had acquired in Aranhal, he decided to pay him a visit. He even intended to drop some hints about the invasion while he was there, just to see if someone would try to murder him again because of it. Who knew, maybe Zenemir was part of some super-secret section of the invaders that other members didn't normally know about. As he approached Zenemir's office, though, he suddenly stopped when he felt a familiar presence. A bunch of cephalic rats were lingering in the area, hidden inside the walls. The swarm quickly withdrew their telepathic probe when they noticed his mind was well shielded, but Zorian was practiced enough at mental shielding that even the faintest of mental attacks could not escape his notice. He frowned. If cephalic rats had been loitering around Zenemir's office back when he had visited the man, it was no wonder that Zorian had ended up being a target. That only raised another questions though. Why were the cephalic rats paying attention to Zenemir? The man was somewhat famous as an incredible polyglot and language expert, but that shouldn't be of much interest to the invaders. After some thought, he decided to leave the cephalic rats alone for now. He knocked on Zenemir's office door and waited. He waited for nearly 15 minutes. Apparently he had arrived at a somewhat bad time, since the old teacher was talking to someone already. Another student, Zorian eventually realized. He took a quick peek at the student's mind to make sure he was not connected to the cephalic rats and found out that he wasn't. He was just a student that had picked Zenemir as his mentor and was now arguing with him over something. Zorian didn't linger inside his mind long enough to find out what, as he disliked invading other people's privacy with his mental powers unless it was truly necessary. Eventually the meeting ended and Zenemir called him in. Zorian gracefully accepted the man's offer to sit down and went right to business. I'm here because I was told you could help me translate a highly technical document written in Aranhal Icosian, Zorian told him. Or at least point me towards someone who is up to the task. Ah yes, Aranhal, Zenemir said sagely. They do speak a particularly distinct form of our tongue, don't they? Can you show me the sample of what you're working with? Zorian took out a few pages of technical writing out of his school bag and handed them to the old language expert. He wasn't worried about Zenemir recognizing them as illegally acquired. Unless he was inexplicably connected to Aranhal's airship construction team in addition to his apparent link to invaders, the text should mean little to him. Zenemir carefully put on a pair of reading glasses and glanced through the papers in silence. Lots of unknown technical jargon, I see. Airship construction materials? My, what an interesting topic, Zenemir mused before giving Zorian a good-natured smile. I can see why you were referred my way, though it somewhat saddens me that a student of our fine academy did not think to seek me out right away. At the very least I'd give you my initial opinion free of charge, which is probably more than you got out of whoever sent you here. Zorian could tell that the man wasn't really angry with him for this oversight, merely giving him a friendly warning that he had failed to take advantage of his academy membership to its fullest extent. Sadly, while Zenemir was both friendly and polite, the events that transpired after Zorian had talked to him the last time around and the cephalic rats lurking in the walls had made it impossible for Zorian to really trust him. So he just nodded sagely at Zenemir's reminder and moved on. Let me ask you something first, Zenemir began. Is this document that you want translated an isolated thing, or are you planning on collaborating with someone from Aranhal on something? The project I'm working on does involve a fair bit of interaction with Aranhal natives, Zorian reluctantly admitted. Thankfully, Zenemir seemed to think nothing of Zorian's admission that he was going to interact heavily with people on another continent. Zorian would think this sort of thing would raise some eyebrows, but apparently not. They spent the next 10 minutes discussing what the translation job would entail. Zenemir asked him a couple of questions about the exact nature of this project he was working on, but thankfully he backed off when Zorian told him it was confidential. He confirmed that this sort of translation job was well within his capabilities, though it would take a couple of days and wouldn't be exactly cheap. None of this was a problem for Zorian though, and he told the old teacher as much before the man raised another idea. I'm going to be a little bold here, but perhaps simply hiring a person to translate this document might not be the best course of action, Zenemir said. I think you should invest some time in learning the language itself. You'd be amazed how many layers of communication you lose by relying on external translation, and I guarantee your partners will respect you a lot more if you can communicate with them directly. I'm unlikely to interact with people from Aranhal after this project is done though, Zorian said, frowning. Plus, he was pretty sure there wouldn't be too many respectful exchanges between him and the Aranhal airship construction team, language barriers or no. That's a lot of wasted effort for one job. Learning a language is never a wasted effort, young man, Zenemir lectured him. It develops your mind and expands your horizons. Besides, it's not as if you're starting completely from scratch. Aranhal Icosian is different from standard Icosian, but not unintelligible. That's true, Zorian admitted. It was more like a heavily divergent dialect with a lot of words borrowed from the native language spoken by the people before Icosian conquest. Much like many of the local versions of Icosian on Altazia, really. It would still be a lot of work for someone who isn't naturally inclined towards languages like you are, though. No offense, Professor Allguy. Humph. Wait here for a minute, Zenemir said, quickly springing up from his chair without waiting for his answer, and then entered a nearby side room in his office and closed the door. He stayed there for over 10 minutes. Judging by the quiet sounds emanating from behind the closed door, the man was shifting around boxes and searching through stacks of paper and books in search of something. Zorian sighed. This was taking way longer than he thought it would. Finally, the old teacher returned to his office, carrying a tall stack of books, folders, and loose sheets of paper. He was carrying so much that he had to use his elbows to manipulate the door handle, which he did with the practiced grace of someone who does things like that all the time. He dumped the pile on the table in front of Zorian and pointed at it. Tell you what, young man, Zenemir said. This here is a small selection of dictionaries, translation guides, and random notes regarding Aranhal Icosian that I had in my storeroom. You just happen to have Aranhal-related stuff in your storeroom? Zorian asked incredulously. Oh, I have all sorts of things gathering dust in there, said Zenemir dismissively. Some of the teachers are rarely in their offices, but I pretty much do most of my work here. So it's handy to have most of my resources close by. Anyway, why don't you take this and see how much of that document of yours you can translate yourself using this as a guide. If you impress me with your work, I promise I'll help you translate the rest of your project for free. Zorian opened his mouth to point out that he'd rather just pay for translation, but Zenemir wouldn't hear it. Free. Zenemir repeated. Do you hate money, young man? Don't be in such a hurry to part with it. I'm not very demanding, don't worry. Just do your best and I'm sure you'll do fine. Who knows, maybe you'll even discover you have a previously undiscovered passion for languages. Zorian seriously doubted that, but he could see there was no use in arguing with Zenemir about this. Besides, now that he thought about it a little, it might actually be useful to get some elementary proficiency in Aranhal Icosian. He might need to interrogate the airship construction crew at some point, and that was going to be really difficult if their language was completely opaque to him. Not even mind reading helped in that case, since people's thoughts were heavily shaped by the language they spoke. Very well, I'll give it a try, Zorian relented. Excellent, Zenemir said, beaming at him happily. Still, is it really okay for you to just give me all this? Zorian pointed at the pile in front of him. Some of this stuff looks irreplaceable. It's fine, said Zenemir, waving him off. You look like a serious young man. I'm sure you'll return it all in one piece. Zorian didn't say anything to that. He just stared at the pile of books and paper in front of him, lost in thought for a few seconds. Well, Zenemir suddenly said, clapping his hands. Is there anything else you wanted to ask? If not. Actually yes, Zorian said. Are you a member of the cult of the World Dragon? Zenemir's eyebrows shot up at the question. I'm sorry, what? He asked. They officially call themselves the Esoteric Order of the Celestial Dragon, Zorian said. They are one of the newer religious organizations, one dedicated to the worship of the entity that is commonly thought to reside in the center of the world. They have a rather large presence here in Cyoria. Are you a member of the order? I think I have heard something about them once, Zenemir mused, tapping his long white beard with his hand. But no, I am not a member. Why do you ask? Are you an agent of Ulquin Ibasa? Zorian asked, completely ignoring the old teacher's question. Now wait just a minute here, Zenemir said, finally getting somewhat angry. What kind of question is that? He was being completely honest. He was not knowingly associated with either the Ibasans of the cult of the World Dragon. With a small sigh, Zorian reached deeper into Zenemir's mind, casually brushing aside the old teacher's rudimentary mental defenses, and modified his short-term memory to erase this conversation out of his mind. The whole process only lasted less than a minute, due to the relatively trivial nature of the memory edit, after which Zorian withdrew from Zenemir's mind. The old teacher blinked a few times, gradually shrugging off the mental daze that Zorian placed on him so he could work in peace, before giving Zorian a surprised look. What happened? He asked. You kind of dozed off for several seconds there, Zorian said, pretending awkwardness. I guess old age is finally catching up to me, Zenemir said ruefully, shaking his head. Where were we again? Actually, I think we're kind of done here, Zorian said. But first let me ask you a somewhat strange question. Do you have any idea why someone would want to spy on you? Spy on me? Zenemir asked incredulously. Why no, I have no idea why someone would want that. Frankly, I wish more people would be interested in my work. If someone wanted to know more about what I do, why all they have to do is ask. I'll cut straight to the chase then, Zorian said. Due to some exotic inborn abilities that I happen to know that there are rats lurking in the walls around your office. And not normal rats either. Now that is quite concerning, said Zenemir. He sat down in his chair and frowned. He tapped on his beard a few more times, deep in thought. Rats in the walls. After a minute or so, Zenemir slapped his palm against the table, scaring Zorian back into attention. Aha! Zenemir said triumphantly. I've got it, I think. I don't think these rats, if they are indeed spies as you suspect, are here for me. As it happens, the headmaster's office is very close to mine. The headmaster is rarely in it, but a lot of visitors and academy documentation passes through the place. Zorian had to agree this did make a great deal of sense. As a place of such importance, the headmaster's office was probably protected by heavier and more sophisticated wards and other defenses, but the corridors approaching it might have been overlooked due to cost-cutting and such. You would have to take a walk through the academy to see if there were other places that cephalic rats linger as they did here. Of course, this will have to be reported. Zenemir's shoulders suddenly sagged. I can already sense a headache coming. So much paperwork. I don't suppose you could exclude me from the report? Zorian asked. He would mind wipe him again if he had to, but he would rather avoid doing that. I might as well, Zenemir sighed. He apparently didn't have a single suspicious bone in his body. No reason for both of us to suffer. Though I have to ask you to keep quiet about this, or else the academy might go after you for ruining its reputation. Zorian assured him that he had no intention of spreading this around, picked up the stack of books and papers the man had given him and then left. Instead of exiting the academy immediately, though, he took the extended route that saw him passing next to the headmaster's office a couple of times. It turned out that yes, all approaches to the headmaster's office had cephalic rats lurking in the walls. It seemed that Zenemir's theory was very much correct. Well, that was one mystery solved. It had been a while since he had solved one of those without raising at least one new question in return. Somehow, it made him feel like he was finally getting close to a solution for all this. Break. In an unremarkable out-of-the-way cave system situated a healthy distance away from Cyoria, Zack, Zorian and 2 Arania were training their magical skills. Zack was tinkering with a large wooden chest, practicing his pocket dimension creation. His ability in this area was slowly but surely overtaking Zorian, despite him dismissing some of his simulacrums and focusing more of his energies on the issue. As far as Zorian could tell, this was purely due to Zack's massive mana reserves and the resulting ability to sustain the mana-intensive training longer than Zorian ever could. Zorian wasn't any more talented or hardworking than Zack was after all, and every advantage and training method he had was also something Zack had access to as well. It made perfect sense that Zack was pulling away from him in this regard, but that didn't stop Zorian from feeling kind of jealous and annoyed with the situation. A petty part of him was tempted to start hiding some of the relevant shaping exercises and tricks he had found while combing through the various spellbooks and training manuals in order to close the gap somewhat, but he resisted the impulse. That would be stupid and self-defeating. Zack getting better was a good thing. That aside, neither Zack nor Zorian had really progressed far in terms of pocket dimension expertise. The chest that Zack was fiddling with still functioned on essentially the same principles as the marble storing boxes they had practiced with previously. It was the simplest form of pocket dimension, which involved expanding the available space inside a container. Essentially, it allowed a mage to produce an enclosed space that was larger on the inside than it was on the outside. There were a lot of limitations involved with this procedure. The pocket dimension required mana to keep existing, so such an item could only be stored in areas where ambient mana was abundant enough to sustain them, or be provided with an inbuilt power source of some sort. A complicated, fiddly spell formula had to be embedded into the walls of the container, or else the space expansion would expire after less than a day, just like any other spell. Finally, the weight of the object inside did not disappear, so a chest with several tons of rock inside would still weigh several tons, no matter how small it looked. Of course, weight concerns aside, cramming too much stuff into your pocket dimension container isn't a good idea to begin with. If the container is damaged, the pocket dimension anchored to its interior would immediately fall apart, forcing the contents back into mundane space. Typically, this meant the pocket dimension would explode, showering everything around it with high-speed shrapnel of its former contents. For this reason, it was also a good idea to make the container as sturdy and damage-resistant as possible. Zack and Zorian learned that very quickly after cramming too many marbles into a box whose bottom could not handle the weight, thus creating their very own marble-flinging cluster bomb. The more time the two of them sank into studying pocket dimensions, the more Zorian realized how incredible the portable palace orb they recovered in Koth was. It had some kind of internal power source that could sustain it indefinitely and made it completely self-sufficient from its surroundings. It weighed no more than a regular glass orb of its size would, and it contained an incredible amount of space and matter inside. Zorian was tempted to dismiss all of this as evidence of divine tampering, except that Silver Lake stubbornly insisted that all of this was potentially achievable through familiar mortal magic. Yes, even the power source thing. Somehow. Then again, she did maintain a rather large pocket dimension with some pretty potent defensive wards in an area that really shouldn't be able to support such. How was she doing that, anyway? Well, it wasn't something that could be figured out by idle contemplation. He put the matter out of his mind for now and focused his attention to the two Arania next to him. Both of them had been sent here by the Silent Doorway Adepts at Zorian's request. Ever since he had become capable of giving them a large list of novel gate addresses and a sizable amount of strategic information about their local region, they became much more willing to cooperate with him and humor his requests. In this case, they allowed him to recruit two of their best retrievers. Thieves, basically. Zorian called them Ghost and Veil, though these were only shortened versions of their real names. Ghost and Veil were originally meant to show him how to use his mental powers to infiltrate guarded sites more easily, but he found them to be surprisingly friendly and curious for a pair of thieves and spies. They fulfilled their part of the bargain without any reservations, and were even willing to go beyond what was originally agreed upon, provided he traded some instruction and secrets of his own to them in return. As such, they were currently gleefully practicing some of the magic he had given them on each other, steadily refining the somewhat clunky spells that had been converted from the human spellcasting system into an Iranian one and thus suffered from a fair bit of inefficiencies. Zorian left them alone to their work for the most part, only involving himself if he saw them making an obvious mistake, but he made sure to survey the results of their work at the end of each day. When he finally found a way for him and Zack to leave this time loop, he intended to bundle up little improvements like this into one giant package and then gift them to the various Iranian webs that had helped him over the years. As for Zorian, he was tackling something that he had wanted to obtain for quite a while now. He was learning the Iranian skill of going dark, the psychic equivalent of the mind blank spell. The skill was pretty hard to obtain since the Irania saw it as inherently shady, meaning that most of them weren't even willing to admit they knew how to perform it, much less trade it to someone who could very well be hostile. It was only after a lot of prodding and some high-value trades that Ghost and Vale agreed to teach it to him. Even then, they made him promise in the strongest possible terms that he would use it sparingly. They need not have worried. Zorian had heard enough horror stories about the mage equivalent of the skill to know he had to be careful about this. Mind blank was well known to be insanity-inducing if used on a long-term basis. Mages that left it active for too long became increasingly paranoid, becoming obsessed with imaginary plots and threats. They would inevitably begin to view everyone around them as a threat, alien and untrustworthy, and withdraw from society as much as possible to pursue their own inscrutable goals. There was a highly publicized case a few years back where a very rich mage went down this path and eventually turned his isolated estate into a foreboding death trap filled with layers upon layers of traps, golems, powerful wards and vicious guard beasts. His children were not very amused when they realized he had blown all of his wealth on that and that they wouldn't be inheriting any of the money that they had been counting on. This going dark was harder than he thought it would be, though. He knew that mind blank was a difficult high-level spell, but he had naively thought that being psychic would negate that somehow. It was a mind-related thing after all, so why wouldn't his innate talent work on it? But no. If anything, that only made things harder. Even mundane mages felt a surge of wrongness upon cutting their minds off from the world, suffering from vertigo, illusionary static noise and headaches before fully mastering the spell. For psychics like Zorian, though, it was a little like plucking out your own eyeballs because you knew you could grow them back later. Even though one knew that no permanent loss would occur, the very idea just felt wrong on a deep-seated visceral level. It wasn't easy to make yourself do this to yourself. He was stalling, he realized. He took a couple of deep breaths, trying to calm himself for another attempt. The 27th time was the charm. He sank his awareness inward, carefully mapped out the borders of his consciousness and then sort of folded his mind upon itself. It was horrible. It can be scarcely described in words alone, but he felt like his whole world had gone dark and confined, pressing down on him. He almost dropped the attempt right there, just like he had so many times before, but he gritted his teeth and persisted. As the borders of his consciousness contracted, getting smaller and smaller, he breathed deeper and deeper, a deep fear welling up from the depths of his soul and causing him to pause. He had an unreasonable, unexplainable feeling of being entombed alive, imprisoned in a cage made out of his own flesh and skin, and it took him an unknown amount of time to take that final step. With one last, desperate push, his mind finally finished folding upon itself and stabilized. The sense of wrongness was still there but muted and manageable. Everything seemed so unnaturally quiet all of a sudden, even though nothing in his surroundings had really changed. Well, okay, that wasn't entirely true. Ghost and Vale had stopped casting spells at each other and were looking at him with interest. "You did it," Vale said excitedly. She was using a vocalization spell instead of resorting to telepathy, since Zorian's current status kind of prevented that. "Amazing. I thought it would take you at least another 30 tries. "It's not that amazing," Ghost said dourly. "It's a decidedly average progression for someone of his level of skill." "He's a human, though," Vale objected. "I don't think it's fair to judge him by our standards." "You're right. We should be even stricter," Ghost said. "After all, he's not nearly as reliant on his mental powers as we are." "I'm right here," Zorian complained. "Don't listen to this killjoy," Vale told him. "Just enjoy knowing that everything will be a lot easier from now on. The first time is always the hardest. Oh, and you should be extra careful about not shutting yourself from the Great Web for too long during these initial steps. The ability degrades the mind much faster if not done flawlessly, and your first handful of attempts probably won't be that good." "Just like mind blank then," Zack noted from the side, not taking his eyes off the chest he was working on. "Until you're sure you mastered the spell, it is recommended you keep it on for no more than half an hour maximum." Sure. I'm not too familiar with human time measurements, but let's go with your friend's suggestion on that," Vale said. Zorian nodded absent-mindedly. Frankly, he was tempted to end the effect immediately, but he knew he had to acclimatize himself to it if he wanted to use it even remotely seriously. He was just about to ask the two Arania if there was anything else he had to watch out when Zack suddenly jumped up and started laughing triumphantly. "It works," Zack said, swinging his chest around and then raising it above his head. It was actually mildly impressive because Zorian knew for a fact that the chest was quite heavy and not something he personally could swing around like that. "It's finished and it totally works." "What were you working on anyway?" Zorian asked. Clearly Zack hadn't been working on just another expanded chest, or else he wouldn't be so happy to succeed. "This?" Zack asked rhetorically, shaking the chest held in his arms. "Why, it's an icebox of beer holding, of course. Not only can it hold a large number of beer bottles, it also keeps them at a nice, cold temperature for perfect consumption." "An icebox of—" "Wait, you made all this fuss about a simple expanded chest with a chilling field added on top?" Zorian asked unhappily. "Oh hush, it's a genius idea," Zack said. "Don't be so cranky. I think the mind blank is already affecting you." Zorian doubted this was true, but he immediately dismissed the effect anyway. Better to be safe than sorry. There was plenty of time to work on this later. Eventually, after an annoyingly long time, Silver Lake agreed to meet with them again. By then, the investigators she had sent after them had thoroughly disrupted their plans and a lot of the restart had already passed, so they were not as enthusiastic about the whole thing as they might have been. Zorian really hoped this could be avoided in future restarts somehow because there was no way they could tolerate these kinds of delays and disruptions on a persistent basis. Surprisingly, she wanted to meet in some public space in Scioria, not in her forest hideout. After some back and forth, they agreed to hold a meeting in one of Scioria's less visited parks. There would be some minor danger of being overheard, but it was likely that anyone that did hear them would dismiss them as speaking nonsense. "You've put me in a very unfavorable position," Silver Lake told them the moment they met. "I think I believe you about this month endlessly repeating itself, as crazy as that sounds, but that means that I basically have no leverage against you whatsoever. You can promise to pay me back in all sorts of ways, but I have no means to enforce any of that. Even if I feed you truth potions and decide you sincerely mean to honor your promises, who's to say you won't ever change your minds in the future? If you decide to renege on your side of the deal, I will never know." "So what's your decision then?" Zorian asked. There was nothing he could say to make her feel better about that. "What else?" she laughed. "I'll work with you and hope you're not planning to screw me over. What other choice do I have?" "We were worried you'd ask to put us under a haze," Zack admitted. It was a reasonable fear. Forced magical oaths were one of the things witches were infamous for using. "Hayas have limited usefulness these days," Silver Lake said, shaking her head sadly. "They were feared once upon a time because mages were comparatively rare and often had a very limited selection of spells at their disposal. In those times, finding someone who could lift a Hayas placed on you was legitimately hard. These days you can just walk into your local mage guild branch and hire someone to get rid of it within a few days. Placing a Hayas on you would just create resentment. No, I'm afraid I'll have to use the carrot and the poison strategy." Isn't that supposed to be the carrot and the stick?" Zorian tried. "We just established that I don't have much of a stick when it comes to you two, no?" Silver Lake said. "So I can't really counterattack, but I can make myself a poisonous pill to swallow. Incidentally, I would like to point out that I have made myself immune to all truth potions I know of and that my mind has been rigged to collapse should my mental defenses ever be violently shattered. This is something I did long before I met you two, so even attacking me first thing in the restart won't negate it. Just an interesting tidbit, you know?" "Yeah, we know," Zack said with exasperation. "Subduing you and trying to forcefully get your secrets out of your mind would be a total chore and take way too much time, so we better ask nicely." "Exactly," Silver Lake nodded happily. "So what's the carrot part of the deal?" Zack asked curiously. "I am an alchemist of incredible skill and I have lived for a very long time. I know how to make many wondrous potions and know incredible secrets, none of which I can be persuaded to share with you in less than a month's time. At the very least, I am confident that you'll seek me out eventually for my secret of how to stop aging and restore your youth. I know you're in the prime of your life now and old age seems distant. But when your body starts to fail and your mind dims, I am confident you'll become interested to discover what I know about the topic." She paused dramatically for a moment. "Of course, if you were really smart, you would strike while the iron is hot and come to me while you're still young and I haven't worked out how to get these blasted eggs on my own. That way I won't think you're desperate for a solution and you'll have lots of things that interest me." You'd be able to get a much better deal that way. How do you know we won't be able to figure out such a thing ourselves? Zack asked. What, you think youth potions grow on trees or something? She scoffed. This is something that takes an absolute master of alchemy to accomplish. You may be decent enough in comparison to your average alchemist, but it takes a lot more than that to tackle this kind of problem. Besides, you seem to be paying other experts to do your alchemical research and complicated work for you. That says everything about your future alchemical expertise, really. There was some truth in that. Zorian did have a healthy amount of interest in alchemy, but he liked spell formula better, and it was impossible to focus on everything at once. Even in a time loop and with a small army of simulacrums running around. So I guess you're not really interested in refining your eternal youth potion over multiple restarts with our help, then? Zorian asked. Good heavens no, why would I want to do that? She asked incredulously. That would just remove what little leverage I have over you, and for what? I'm confident I'll get it right eventually. I have time even without the time loop. I've been working on this for a very long time. What's a couple of years more? I see, Zorian said. Well, I am glad you are at least willing to work with us on this. Though I do hope your future selves will not sabotage our work with spying and delay the meeting for most of the month like you have. I don't know about that, Silverlake said, not in the least bit apologetic. Your story is very crazy and requires checking. It's hard to speed that up. Well, don't be so sure about that, Zorian said, reaching into his backpack to retrieve a handful of Kale's notebooks that the Morlock boy had given him permission to share with others. Let me tell you about the wonders of notebook transfers across restarts. Break. With Silverlake's cooperation secured, the restart ended uneventfully, the only notable difference being the larger number of notebooks that Zorian was transferring into the next restart. Considering that the orb's memory bank was practically limitless in size, this was not a big deal. The next several restarts were somewhat routine. They were learning pocket dimension expertise from Silverlake, looking deeper into Veyer's ties with the cult of the World Dragon, figuring out the activation procedure of the Bakura gates and the construction methods of the Abasan ones, doing small preparations for the airship theft, experimenting with divine artifacts and sifting through the ruins inside the portable palace orb. Zorian was messing around with mental enhancements while Zack was steadily getting closer to being able to create his own simulacrums. Their various other operations, such as hiring various experts to do research and development for them, also continued at a steady pace. Just like that, another 6 restarts had gone by.